Interpretation in a more obvious sense takes place in the political realm all the time. So if you followed the Clarence Thomas hearings, and I've promised in these lectures not to go off on my political digressions, so I'll try to keep this one brief. But if you followed the Judge Thomas hearings, you'll notice that questions of interpretation arose again and again in a quite practical context. By that I mean something hung on both what he interpreted, he had said in the past, and on how he would interpret in the future. So interpretation is very important. This can also be made clear historically. Although we don't make a big deal out of interpreting the Bible anymore, we adopt a kind of live and let live attitude based upon our real smudgy belief in God. Now, that USA Today belief, you know, they ask in USA Today how many Americans believe in God, and 98% say, well, yes. In the normal American factoid way of believing, it's just you're asked if you do, and you don't want to be embarrassed. Oh, sure, yeah. But there was a time in the history of Western civilization when people burned because they read a book with the wrong interpretation. I want you to understand interpretation, a lot depends on interpretation. Because they interpreted the Bible, the biblical text wrong, whole groups of people might burn. So there are stakes to interpretation. So as we discuss this throughout the course, please don't think that this is some airy, stupid, academic dispute. In fact, I would argue that the last 10 years of political life have been about the attempt to kill the very desire to interpret. In a certain way, there's been a certain trajectory, social trajectory, which the text of Nietzsche addresses, that involves accepting surfaces and to kill the urge to interpret in anything but the most superficial way. And that will be part of the social and political aspect of the argument I will develop, okay? Now, no thinker, and I'm going to avoid calling Nietzsche a philosopher. The reason is that I know a lot of professional philosophers, and I don't want to sully Nietzsche's memory in this way. Nietzsche, the writer, we will call him, a kind of writer, is importantly engaged in interpretation that will lead us not only into these contemporary issues and into theoretical issues, but he won't stay with just theoretical issues. They will be profoundly, importantly practical issues. Okay, well now back to the second paradox. Nietzsche's work suggests that in a certain sense it may be impossible to find what many people think they find when they interpret, namely the right interpretation. One of Nietzsche's primary targets is the notion that there is such a thing as the right interpretation in general. That's what makes it a theoretical point. However, the paradox now is obvious, right? Because the paradox generated by his writings is, if that thesis suggested by his writings were correct, then the ideal way to present Nietzsche would not be to present an interpretation of Nietzsche, but to do what he suggests in other places in his work, which is to develop a creative, brilliant performance of one's own that sort of created oneself in a new way. And if one used Nietzsche's name, it wouldn't matter whether one, or it might matter if it made the performance better, in what way one used it. But that's a very peculiar way to look at a book. In other words, a series of texts that suggest that there's an impossibility in getting them right. And it's not what we standardly, I think, or most of us standardly believe we do when we interpret. I don't know how many of you are familiar with things like Southern Baptist conventions. I don't attend them, but they take interpretation very seriously, and when they debate it, someone's is right. Generally, the persons who just offered it arguing with someone else. But I mean, the underlying idea is that an interpretation can be the right one, especially in regard to a text like the Bible. This is a deep belief that also runs throughout universities and has generated a current debate at the universities over the losses of standards and objectivity. Because according to, for example, Alan Bloom in The Closing of the American Mind, and according to Buckley and many other conservatives, now labeled neo, most of them have gotten older, and as they get older, they're now called neo. I will drop that. I will call them paleo conservatives. Paleo conservatives find in Nietzsche a very troubling feature of a figure because of this effect generated by his writings, that interpretations are multiple, contestable, and might finally be judged by which end up being the most interesting. On the other hand, some interpretations might be in place simply because they are backed by the most power. Point we'll get to in a later lecture. That many interpretations may be in place not because they're rational or argumentatively supported, but simply because they're backed by the most power. Once this specter has been raised about interpretation in general, then it looks like we have attained a sort of insight, if we do, and we're going to have to follow the text of Nietzsche, for which I'm just preparing us now. If we do think this is an insight and follow it out, it seems to make the university a very, odd place, because then when the philosophy professor puts his Plato notes on the board, or her Plato notes on the board, the student has no reason to think that that's any more interesting than their own notes based on their own reading, apart from the institutional power of the person presenting, apart from that. Well, this is the notion, of course, that's outraged Bloom, because this destroys standards. Well, whose standards? Well, of course, people like him. Academics, their standards. It reminds me of the scene in Full Metal Jacket, where the drill instructor says it's okay to believe in God when you're in the Marine Corps. Your heart can belong to Jesus, but when you're in the Marine Corps, you play our games, we play our little games, they play their little games. God plays his little games. He loves Marines. That's not the actual line. I can't do it here. He loves Marines. We keep his, heaven filled with souls, and so he lets us play our little games. Well, academics are kind of like that drill instructor, and if it turned out that they didn't have some special, this is in the humanities in particular, but the argument might even hold across many areas of science. But I hope you follow the point. If academics didn't hold a certain key to interpretation that their students needed to decipher and pay money in order to learn to decipher, they wouldn't have anything to do for a living. Do you follow me? They wouldn't have anything to do for a living. And I don't want to make that sound crude, but on the other hand, I don't want to lie. It is crucially important in the political economy of the university to try to deny Nietzsche's insight for this reason. If it is one, we will argue that. Because if it is one, it's paradoxical, because it will mean that what I'm now saying and the lessons I'm drawing from this insight, which is that interpretation may prove to be undecidable or impossible or whatever, if that is an insight, the challenge it poses is that people would have to begin their lectures by saying things like this: I'm paid a lot of money and I have tenure at a very famous place. You will now take notes. Instead of beginning with, this is my methodology carefully developed over years of study. In other words, one would begin to see then what Nietzsche suggests in text after text, which is that the origins of such methodologies are in relations of power. That the methodological languages, however sophisticated, will in some sense instantiate those institutional powers. Traced to their origins, they will themselves prove to rest upon undecidable and interpretable material and not upon the facts themselves.